People in Boston can take pride in the city's role in the struggle against slavery, but the city also had a pivotal role in the slave economy, connecting American colonies with Africa and the Caribbean. That full history, from atrocities to heroic resilience, will be observed locally on Sunday. This is part of a world celebration by the United Nations and the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Makers Project. We'd like to welcome as our guest from the project, the Boston representative, Dr. Vivian Johnson. Thank you very much for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, talk about why is Boston such a big part of this?
Well, because Boston was actually a Middle Passage port. That is not a well-known fact, but indeed, in Governor Winthrop's diary in 1638, he mentioned that the ship the Desire returned from the Caribbean with Africans on board. Those were enslaved Africans, and thus began the slave trade here in Boston. Indeed, in 1704, there began to be slave advertisements in the local newspaper. And those advertisements for enslaved Africans continued for 77 years. So that's a long time. Boston was a part of the slave economy, the international slave economy, and it lasted for quite a long time.
You know, when I was reviewing some information about the history here, the first thing that staggered me was the size of this.
Yes, yes. We're talking, and there are estimates anywhere from 10 to 15. Most people talk about 10 to 12 million people over a 300-year period. That's a very long time, and a lot of people who were captured, who endured the Middle Passage. About 2 million, it is estimated, perished in that process because it was such an inhuman, horrific passage. And those who survived then were brought to places in the Americas.
Of course, another thing that's interesting about this history, and I only learned this lately, is that the big money coming out of this was not here in the colonies as much as in the Caribbean, and there's a connection between here and the Caribbean.
Yes, many of the owners of what we think of as plantations had those plantations in the Caribbean. They had some slaves in their households here in Boston without any question, but the large numbers of slaves that were owned, like with Isaac Royal, for example, who had slaves in Antigua. There were slaves in Barbados, in Jamaica, in other places in the Caribbean.
What about the lessons here that you want people to draw from this? I mean, because a lot of people watching tonight say, well, I've heard this story before, but what's different about looking at it now?
I think there are several things. One is the importance of the shared history that we share with people in a large number of places around the world, in what is now often called the Atlantic world. And so on August 23rd, on Sunday, we will be having a ceremony of remembrance, as will people in other places, because this date has been designated by the United Nations as the International Day of Remembrance of the Middle Passage and its abolition.
Of course, you also want to remember not just the terrible things that happened, but maybe some of the people who made that passage and did something that is worth remembering.
Well, in Boston, we have one person who is Phyllis Wheatley. She was a child of perhaps no more than 7 years. We've never known her exact age, but we are told that she was missing front teeth and therefore was about 7 years old when she came to a port in Boston on the ship, the Phyllis, after which John Wheatley named her. So that is where she got her name. That port is down in an area of Boston that is now filled in, but it was a very active port at the time. Phyllis Wheatley then, a genius without question, not only learned English very quickly, but began writing poetry somewhere around 11 years old. And as we know, she published poems while still a teenager, and she was an just absolutely remarkable person. So yes, we do have someone who we know came through the Middle Passage and who was able to make an extraordinary contribution to our literary society.
Of course, you just opened the door to the other angle on this history, which is that slavery is a condition. It's not so much a history of a people, and a lot of the people went from that condition to other conditions. They became free people. They made a difference in Boston history.
Absolutely, absolutely. People resisted. I think that is a very important fact that should be well known. People resisted. And in their resistance, they found ways to escape. They found ways to protest. They found ways to be disobedient. They found ways to organize. And here in Boston, we see some of that organization, just extraordinary amount of organization on Beacon Hill and in the West End with the African American population there who protested and resisted throughout. And they were leaders in the nation and internationally in the way that they carried out those organized protests. And so we have very much to be proud of in this city, which became, of course, a leader in the abolition movement.
Of course, this is not just about protesting. These are people who built institutions and other things, too.
Absolutely.
Like the meeting house.
Like the African Meeting House built in 1806, absolutely. And in so building, they brought together that community for worship service, for all manner of community activities, for school, and for organized protests. They did all of it there at the African Meeting House. So they built an institution in the community that has survived, and they did that while they were assisting people to escape, while they were preparing petitions and submitting those petitions. They were involved in protest all the time.
We should mention what exactly will be happening with the observance on Sunday?
Well, we will have an opportunity to hear from the three co-chairs who are the Honorable Byron Rushing, from the state legislature. We will hear from Beverly Morgan Welsh, who is the executive director of the Museum of African American History, and we will hear from the new superintendent of Boston's National Historic Parks, Michael Creasy. So that's one aspect of the program. We will also hear from people of faith who will reflect on the meaning of the Middle Passage, on their idea about remembrance. We will also see young children who will, in a ceremony, present their remembrances of the Middle Passage. So it will be a full program, 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Faneuil Hall. We hope that everyone will attend.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Vivian Johnson. In a moment, we'll hear about a new program for elders in Jamaica Plain.